Welcome to the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding's Civil Rights Leaders Conversation series. Our subject is the role of the Jewish community in combating racial inequality and racial injustice. We are so privileged and so honored to have with us today one of the great civil rights leaders of our nation, Morial, who is the president and the CEO of the National Urban League, our nation's largest and historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization. Mark is also the former mayor of New Orleans, and I can go on and on and on, but let's get to the subject at hand. During the civil rights struggle in the 1950s and 60s, there was no segment of American society that provided as much and as consistent support to Dr. King and to African Americans as did the Jewish community. The Jewish community understood that a people who fight for their own rights are only as honorable as when they fight for the rights of all people. And today, proudly, the Jewish community is very committed to combating any systemic form of racial injustice, racial bias in our society. And we're turning to some of our nation's most prominent, distinguished, leading civil rights figures to guide us in the Jewish community in terms of the role that we can play in solidarity with our African American brothers and sisters as the march, the fight for civil rights continues. So let me begin with my first question to Marc Morial. You oversee, as I mentioned before, the largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization in our country. Why do you think it took the senseless and brutal killing of George Floyd to mobilize and galvanize the African American community and men and women from all walks of life across America? After all, Mark, there have been countless others who've been brutalized by such racial injustice and racial hatred. What was it about this particular killing that brought about the tremendous response that we are seeing in the United States and around the world?
Well, Rabbi, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And let me thank you for your always continuous and generous outreach and friendship in being a person who wants to build bridges between communities. And it's just an honor to be with you for this conversation. George Floyd and his killing was unambiguous. There was no vagueness. There was no room for doubt whatsoever due to the fact that a courageous 17-year-old girl on her own phone taped the incident. And that when you look at what she taped along with the security tapes and the body cams that have come out, what is absolutely clear is that George Floyd did not deserve to die. He didn't really deserve to be handcuffed. He didn't deserve to be down on the ground. He certainly did not deserve to be murdered. And the eyes, people's eyes, their own eyes, could see how heinous, how brutal. Here's a man on the streets of Minneapolis with his neighbors who were on the sidewalk, in effect begging for his life. With one gentleman saying, "What are you doing?" He can't breathe. George Floyd is saying he can't breathe. So there was no room for ambiguity. And this happens at a time when we're all dealing with the pandemic of COVID. Over 100,000 of our friends, neighbors, countrymen and women who've died, 35, 40 million plus who are out of work, all of the stress and attention. And then you see an act of police violence played out on the streets of Minneapolis in a way that struck just a nerve. It struck a nerve from Minneapolis to Miami, from Miami to Seattle, from Seattle to Saskatchewan, from Saskatchewan to Sag Harbor, to Budapest, Hungary, to Auckland, New Zealand, to Paris, to London. The reaction has been universal and global because people saw it and they said, enough is enough, and we're absolutely tired of this. African Americans and Jews, and I'll offer my own personal perspective. As a boy growing up in New Orleans, my parents were very active in the civil rights movement. My father was the NAACP branch president. My mother was a teacher and an activist. And they were involved in and with a multiracial group of young couples and young activists and people who worked for a better New Orleans. Many of the members of the white community who participated in that group were also Jewish. One of the first times I ever swam in a non-segregated pool, it was at the Jewish Community Center in New Orleans. When one of my mother's friends, Bernice Leader, who was president of the League of Women Voters, or active in the League of Women Voters at that time, said, "Sybil, I'm taking your children to swim at the Jewish Community Center." And my mother said, "Well, they can't get in there." She says, "We're going in there." Now, Bernice Leader was from New York. She was not a Southerner, so she was extremely, I remember her just completely put off by segregation and the mentality and the absurdity of it. And I must have been 4, 5, 6 years old. And in we went, right into the Jewish Community Center. In we went, right out to the pool, got in the pool, and that was that. And I will never forget that the important role and the relationship that the Jewish community played in those early days of my life in the civil rights movement that I had an opportunity to be a part of as a child by just being observing and being around. In 1977, when my father ran for mayor, and he had to build a black-white coalition because the city at the time, New Orleans, was still predominantly white. It was a compendium of leaders in the Jewish community that embraced his candidacy and helped him build the coalition he needed to win. So from my perspective as a person from the South, the Jewish community was always an important player and role in the battle for political inclusion, economic justice, and justice in my hometown of New Orleans. And so at this point, at this indeed inflection point in American history, I think that the relationship with and the role of the Jewish community and Jewish leaders is critical because American Jews and Jews all over the world have felt the pain and the sting of discrimination, not like what we have had to go through as having our relatives enslaved and enduring segregation, but watching relatives be terrorized and killed in the Holocaust and enduring mistreatment in so many nations where there were Jewish communities. And I think that that's always been the rationale, the reason, the animation between the relationship between African Americans and Jews. It was a sense of there's some level of shared suffering, some level of an understanding. I remember not understanding, but coming to understand as a boy when my mother would point to various prominent actors or actresses and say, that person's Jewish, and they had to change their name. And I think they had to change their name. 8, 9 years old, 10 years old. She said, yeah, because they would not have been accepted. And she'd say, see, we can't change our color.
Right.
She said, but they changed their names, but they would have to hide to some extent who they were to be accepted in a Hollywood that had anti-Semitism in it, or to find their way into certain high-profile jobs so they wouldn't be rejected. So I think that there's an essence behind the relationship with history that African Americans have had and Jews have had that creates an animation for the bond. And knowing that history and understanding that history, African Americans and Jews should know each other's history to a greater degree and at a greater level. And I think then the historic nature of the relationship would in fact be better understood by a wider range of people.
There's no question that this historic alliance between Blacks and Jews that you reference was greatly responsible for some of the greatest social and political changes in our nation. And that alliance clearly has been re-energized by this most tragic incident in the killing of George Floyd, and why Blacks and Jews continued the march towards civil rights.
But
and
I would say this too, Rabbi. Of recent, it was a Black church in Charleston, South Carolina,
correct,
where a hater took the lives of people worshiping and praying to their God. It was a Jewish synagogue in Pittsburgh where a hater took the lives of innocent people worshiping their God. I mean, I can't even still to this day wrap my head around the heinousness of the hate of someone who would take the lives of people in the ultimate place of peace.
correct.
The ultimate place of peace where people are worshiping, not even a church. And it happened in a Sikh temple in Wisconsin years ago. Not even in a place of worship with the haters, the racists and the anti-Semites say, no, that's off limits.
Look, I still recall a project that you and I worked on in the mid to late 1990s when Black churches were set ablaze in different parts of the South. And I was then in addition to being president of the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, I was the president of the New York Board of Rabbis. And I established a fund called From the Ashes. And there was such an outpouring on the part of the Jewish community wanting to restore those churches that we partnered closely with you, my friend Mark, and the National Urban League. So even our shared history and our shared dreams goes back together almost 30 years. So I have another question for you that as mayor of New Orleans, from 1994 to 2002, you oversaw improvements in crime reduction, police reform, healthcare. COVID-19 has taken a disproportional toll on Black and Brown communities. What steps are needed to protect the health of these Black and Brown communities in America?
So while I may not be the most qualified person or a qualified public health expert, I can offer some observations from some of the work and some of the learnings over the last several months and years. And that is, number one, we have to increase and improve access to healthcare. The Affordable Care Act took some steps in that direction, but until everyone has access to a primary care physician, until everyone has access to the medicines and the specialists they need, when they need it, on terms that they can afford, we are going to continue to have health disparities. Until we create a system in America around healthcare, which is not a sick system to deal with the sick, but a system to promote and enhance wellness, we're going to have health disparities in the United States. So we need a transformation of our public health system. We need a dramatic expansion of availability to insurance. We need health professionals, doctors, nurses, physicians, assistants, to be more culturally competent and sensitive across the board when you're ministering to, when you're treating a diverse population, you've got to understand some of the social and economic characteristics, some of the challenges that they face in their life to be a good provider of healthcare. We need to improve in this COVID environment, expand availability of testing. When the vaccine is available, ensure that the vaccine is going to be available on a fair basis, first to those who are at greatest risk, then to everyone across the board. Those things are steps that are within our reach without moving a mountain or without moving a mountain range. Those things are within reach, providing and enabling almost universal testing across the board, providing and enabling, when it's available, the vaccine on a fair and reasonable basis. We have to keep our eye and on those things. And my hope is that the leaders of this nation, states and leaders of states, leaders of cities, are working on how to make sure that the vaccine, when it's available, is going to be administered to everyone on a fair and equitable basis.
Two more questions for you, my friend. First, you recently authored a book called Gumbo Coalition, where you describe what it takes to unite people from all backgrounds under a common cause. We spoke about the historic Black-Jewish alliance as being that paradigm here in the United States. In what way can interfaith leaders advance civil rights as a means of inspiring needed change and healing today?
I think interfaith leaders don't quite understand how powerful they are. I think faith leaders don't understand the influence they have beyond their pews, beyond their pulpits, beyond their sanctuaries, beyond their houses of worship. Because faith leaders have a chance to be moral leaders. And I think when leaders work on a faith basis, they have a chance to demonstrate communities that, notwithstanding differences, there are many things that unite us, that we can work on together, that we can try to achieve together. In our nation today, sometimes politics gets in the way. It enables and then it divides. And I think what faith leaders have a unique opportunity to do, if they will, is to be the moral voice, the binding voice, the healing voice, the voice that brings people together. And I think there's nothing more powerful than leaders of faith working across faith lines. In my family, it was a political tradition, really started by my father, that at the moment of his inauguration as mayor, or in the moment of his swearing in, he was a judge before he was mayor, that there was always a interfaith celebration, an ecumenical service. So way back in the 1970s, when he was inaugurated, he brought the Catholic, he brought the Jewish, he brought the Muslim, he brought the leaders of all of the Protestant denominations in the city together at the St. Louis Cathedral for an interfaith, or ecumenical as he called it, celebration. I continued and embraced that tradition, the idea that that the faith leaders united had an impact and a special influence on the minds and the hearts and the souls of people in the city. And I don't think we see enough publicly of faith leaders, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, together publicly saying the same thing, or articulating similar messages around basic principles: fairness, justice, opportunity, tolerance, lack of hatred. It's still true, regrettably, that the most segregated hour in America, segregated hours are on Saturday and Sunday mornings, right? When people are worshiping. That Dr. King said that, that's true today, but it shouldn't stand in the way of the role that faith leaders can play. And you've gone beyond the mold in doing this. I am certain that for doing it, you've caught shade or criticism or barbs. But maybe when people do that, they're just being jealous. They may wish that they would do it, but that power, and the Gumbo Coalition, my book, that's the philosophy of trying to build purposeful coalitions, not just coming together because we want to come together, coming together to try to make things happen. And in my time, we worked on public safety, we worked on infrastructure, we worked on a wide range of issues, and I valued the role that the faith leaders played because they were always a hedge against sometimes uncooperative politicians, to be quite honest, who sometimes looked at issues from a leverage standpoint or a wheeling and dealing standpoint, whereas I found my faith leaders, in most instances, were interested in the good of the order, in the good of the day, without much precondition.
As you said, coming together for a specific cause, I often speak of both our common faith and our common fate, and how our single destiny must strengthen our bonds of concern, compassion, and caring for each other. So my last question is the following. You're aware as the head of the National Urban League and one of our most prominent civil rights leaders in our country that unfortunately anti-Semitism is on the rise in 2020. And even some of the protests of late took an ugly turn with synagogues and Jewish shops in LA being targeted and defaced. What words of solidarity, what words of comfort can you offer the Jewish community
You know,
in light of
I can absolutely condemn that type of violence against places of worship or against anybody's property or business, particularly if it's motivated by anti-Semitism or hatred. It should be absolutely condemned, and we should leave no air and no space to suggest that that's legitimate. And, you know, there are those, I've been to multiple protests, overwhelmingly they're peaceful. But there are interlopers and interceders and people who are troublemakers who involve themselves to take advantage of the situation. And I hope people will understand that everyone that comes to a protest may not come with the same intent. Most do, but some don't. They come to create confusion, and we can't allow that to separate. But I think I have no tolerance for any of the violence that's taking place. I'm in the school of Dr. King. The fact that the moral power of nonviolence is as powerful as anything, and that the use of violence may temporarily put people in a posture where they're fearful, that in the long run it creates deep resentment and deep backlash. So I think the Jewish community should know and never hesitate to call on us when something happens that we should speak out against.
Thank you. This was simply a wonderful,
Thank you.
very inspirational conversation. I'm glad we got to address the responsibility of interfaith leaders, many who are suffering today from a deafening silence or a moral laryngitis. They need to raise their voices in screaming protest. They need to raise those voices in screaming protest. It was Dr. King who often quoted Edmund Burke, who said, all that's necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And Mark, you are truly not only one of the good people, but you're leading all those good people in doing something and making our society a society of fairness and equity, of understanding. And we really, really were so honored, feel so privileged to have had this conversation. May God continue
Yes,
to
sir.
watch over you in all your extraordinary endeavors on behalf of the National Urban League, on behalf of our country, on behalf of the world. And it's just been great connecting. And
Great connecting with you. I want to thank you for your leadership and
thank you.
continued friendship. And let's continue to push ahead for justice.
Looking forward, my friend. All the best. Thank
God
you.
bless you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.